Hi guys, welcome back. In the previous video, we discussed about the indifference curve, and in this video, we are going to discuss about two things, that is the indifference map and the marginal rate of substitution. Now, indifference map is a simple thing, nothing too complicated, more or less it's just building upon the concept that we studied about in the previous class about indifference curves. We have already obtained the indifference curve. We have learned to how do we derive it, how do we draw an indifference curve for a consumer. But you need to understand that when we say that the indifference curve is showing different combinations at where the consumer is indifferent, but we also said that there is a superior region where we said that all combinations are superior, which means that the consumer is aware that these are my preferences that I would prefer over an indifference curve to the left, which means that the consumer would always prefer a higher indifference curve, which also means that there could be multiple indifference curve, each having in the superior region, and the consumer would be totally aware. And that is the assumption that we're making, that the consumer is aware that yes, there is a higher indifference curve that I would want to be at. So a collection of indifference curve is basically called the indifference map basically. And the indifference map is just reflecting the behavior of the consumer in the sense that it just shows that there are different indifference curve on the indifference map, each higher indifference curve representing higher individual satisfaction. And so if you see this box that I have made is this is the purple shaded region is simply representing that, but in the purple shaded region there are uncountable number of combinations, right? And each point that you see over here in yellow, green, blue, black is representing a combination of two goods of good X and good Y. And among these points the consumer, like ये जो indifference map पे आपको पूरी ये indifference map है basically. Among these points the consumer is able to assign the consumer is able to assign equal ranks to a few combinations, and the consumer at the same time is also able to assign higher ranks to some combinations and lower ranks to some combinations. For example, if you see the yellow colored dots, we can draw our first indifference curve. If we join all these together, this is how indifference curve would look like. IC1, right? And so all the combinations on IC1 would represent same satisfaction. The consumer which is equally acceptable to both, and the consumer is indifferent, right? And so this is what is meant by indifference hypothesis, right? So indifference hypothesis telling us कि ठीक है fine, indifference hypothesis हमें ये बता रहा है कि within the same indifference curve the consumer is indifferent among all the combinations that are on that indifference curve. और फिर अभी आगे जाके आप पढ़ेंगे indifference hypothesis हमें ये बताएगा कि ठीक है, the consumer knows that okay fine, this is the indifference curve that yields the same satisfaction, but then we have higher indifference curve as well that represents higher satisfaction. And so ठीक है, which means a consumer जो है वो एक और set of combination भी identify कर सकता है. For example, the green dots को if we join these green dots together we get IC2, and this is representing IC2, and which gives the consumer again a higher satisfaction. Now we can't in absolute terms we can't measure that satisfaction quantitatively, but we know that it gives a higher level of satisfaction for the consumer. But within that indifference curve, as in although the indifference curve on the right IC2 gives a higher satisfaction, but within that indifference curve all combinations yield the same satisfaction. Also जब हम ये तो वही वाली बात है कि if we look at जब हम indifference map draw कर रहे हैं, so हमारी assumption यही है that the consumer is aware, he has the ability to rank his preference कि ठीक है IC2 is more satisfactory than IC1, it gives a higher satisfaction, and the preference and difference hypothesis कि भाई consumer IC2 को prefer करेगा rather than IC1. Moving तो वही वाली बात है कि IC2 is more preferable than IC2 is more preferable than IC1, right? But why is IC2 more preferable? Because consumer को कैसे पता चला? Because हमारी assumption ही यही है that the consumer has the ability to rank his preference. Ordinal utility theory की assumption ही यही है that the consumer has the ability to rank his preference. ठीक है, how will you arrive at the optimum bundle जो आगे जाके consumer equilibrium पढ़ेंगे, when हम assumption ये ले ही नहीं सकते, अगर हम ये assumption ले ही नहीं पा रहे कि the consumer can rank its preference. तो फर्स्टली द कंज्यूमर मस्ट बी, हमारी assumption इसीलिए यही हमने ली है कि भाई कंज्यूमर अपनी प्रेफरेंस को रैंक कर सकता है, ही नोज कि IC2 इज़ मोर प्रेफरेबल. ठीक है, सो फॉर एग्जाम्पल अगर हम दो IC कर्व्स देखें IC1 IC2, तो एफ एंड जी जो है अगर हम देखें एफ एंड जी पॉइंट्स एफ एंड जी contain the points f and g contain the same level of good y, but g has more good x. But still consumers would prefer g over f. Why? Because we know it's on a higher indifference curve. Although the consumer is not indifferent, so the consumer is not indifferent between f and g. Consumer is not indifferent between them, but the consumer is indifferent between f and f1, right? Obviously, when the consumer would be offered g, so he would categorically, specifically, he would prefer G. Again, ये क्या है? I mean, this is the preference hypothesis. जब आप एग्जाम में असेसमेंट ऑब्जेक्टिव 1 में हमारा आंसरिंग का क्वेश्चन और इंडिफरेंस एनालिसिस जब आप ये लिखेंगे that the consumer prefers a higher indifference curve, तो आप ये बोलेंगे it is assumed that the consumer is aware of his preferences, right? Which is, और ब्रैकेट में लिख देना कि this is the preference hypothesis, right? That what do consumers prefer? तो इकोनॉमिक टर्म है that will help you in your answer 20 mark answer, वहाँ पे you can write this, ठीक है? So preference hypothesis यही है that consumer knows his preference, which means that within the indifference curve the consumer is indifferent within the same indifference curve, but between IC2 and IC1 he is not indifferent. Consumer is able to show his preference. He knows that okay fine, IC2 is more preferable and he would definitely prefer G over F, right? और यही चीज़ मैंने यहाँ पे भी ब्रैकेट में लिखी हुई है. यू कैन जस्ट रीड दिस ऑन योर ओन, समझ में आ जाएगा आपको. कॉपी दिस डाउन. मूविंग फॉरवर्ड, जैसे लाइक कंज्यूमर इज सो ऑन IC1 एंड आई मीन जस्ट लाइक द कंज्यूमर इज आइडेंटिफाइंग अ ग्रुप ऑफ कॉम्बिनेशन. अगर यू नो इफ द कंज्यूमर हैज आइडेंटिफाइड अ ग्रुप ऑफ कॉम्बिनेशंस, देखें हमें ये बात पता इंडिफरेंस मैप पे वेरियस कॉम्बिनेशंस हैं. And some combinations consumer is indifferent, some he is not. Some is providing a less satisfaction, some combinations he is indifferent, some जो है वो are providing him with higher satisfaction. So consumers by identifying one group of combination gets IC1. भाई एक ऐसे ग्रुप ऑफ कॉम्बिनेशंस होंगे जिसके अंदर वो इंडिफरेंट होगा उन सारे कॉम्बिनेशंस पे, तो वो जो सारे कॉम्बिनेशंस पे वो इंडिफरेंट होगा, उधर से हमें एक इंडिफरेंस कर्व बन जाएगा. ठीक है. इसी तरह he can identify another set of combinations that he is indifferent at, but that gives a higher satisfaction than the previous set of combinations on the indifference curve. So the consumer can draw IC2, right? This is IC2. Similarly the consumer can draw is another IC, that is IC3. So the point is कि what is true for IC1 and IC2 is true for every other indifference curve so obtained. And in this space, as in this space, अगर ये indifference map है हमारा, the consumer could get as many indifference curves in this space. Make sense? So this is representing the indifference map. That is why what we are saying is that we can draw multiple indifference curve with each indifference curve representing a higher level of satisfaction. So ये आपका indifference map है basically. So indifference map क्या है? It is just a set of indifference curve. ठीक है. It is showing what? It is showing tastes and preferences of the consumer, and which tastes and preferences of the consumer mean, and the consumer is aware of his preferences. He can rank them in the order of preference, the combinations within that. And so and again, the objective is that the consumer wants to reach the highest possible indifference curve. Consumer का aim क्या है? इसको लिख लेते हैं, इसको underline कर लेते हैं, because ये important है कि consumer जो है वो चाहता क्या है? He wants to reach the highest possible indifference curve, right? So an indifference curve that is to the left represents lower satisfaction because that's an inferior region. ये हम देख चुके हैं पिछली वीडियो में भी. And IC3 would represent higher satisfaction more than IC2 anyways. So and the further the curve is from the origin. For example, जितना ज़्यादा दूर होगा from the origin. For example, अगर हम IC4 की बात करें, the higher the level of satisfaction it represents, right? And if the consumer moves along the arrow, he is climbing a utility mountain. देखिए यहाँ पे मैंने arrow बनाया हुआ है, मैंने यहाँ पे 4 points ले लूँ A, B, C, D. So point B is giving a high level of satisfaction than combination A. Combination C is giving a high level of satisfaction than B and A, and so on and so forth. Or we can pass. If we these combinations, ये क्या हैं? ये combinations है ना, A, B, C, D. ये combinations हैं. Each combination on a higher indifference curve. And if we, because ये तो multiple indifference curves होंगे बीच में, मैं बनाए हुए नहीं है, but he assumed है कि there could be multiple indifference curves here, right? And so if we draw a line through those points and through those higher combinations representing a high level of satisfaction, we get एक तरह से it just looks like the consumer is, The consumer moves along the arrow, he is basically climbing a utility mountain, basically moving to a even higher utility level and crossing an even higher indifference curve, but ever crossing ever higher equal utility indifference curves. Equal utility means that within the higher, as in within the indifference curve, the utility or satisfaction is the same, right? Because the consumer is indifferent between them, right? So indifference map simply क्या बता रहा है? What any consumer would like to do, and what would he like to do? He would like to reach the highest possible indifference curve. That is, he would want to climb as high as the utility mountain as possible. ये लिख लेना अपने आंसर में, असेसमेंट ऑब्जेक्टिव 1 में, ये लाइन एज इट इज. लेकिन देखें, ये तो देखें यूटिलिटी थ्योरी, सॉरी इंडिफरेंस एनालिसिस यानी ऑर्डिनल यूटिलिटी थ्योरी हमें सबसे पहले क्या सिखा रही है? कंज्यूमर के प्रेफरेंसेस क्या हैं. एक हायर प्रेफरेंस है, लोअर प्रेफरेंस है, कभी वो इंडिफरेंट और कॉम्बिनेशन जिसपे वो इंडिफरेंट है. अभी सबसे पहले ऑर्डिनल यूटिलिटी थ्योरी हमें इंडिफरेंस कंज्यूमर के प्रेफरेंसेस सिखा रही है. फिर हम आ जाएंगे बजट लाइन पे. अच्छा ठीक है, विच मीन्स दैट इफ ही वॉन्ट्स टू क्लाइम द यूटिलिटी माउंटेन, लेट्स से ही वॉन्ट्स टू बी ऑन IC4 एज कंपेयर टू IC1, बट कैन ही डू दैट? डज ही हैव द बजट? उसके लिए कैन ही डू बी एट IC4? We need to construct the budget line, which is obviously the topic of the future videos. A rational consumer would want to be on the higher indifference curve. ठीक है? So yes, and so copy this as well. ठीक है, ये जो मैंने लिखा हुआ है, and yeah, more or less I think and ये भी मैंने आपको बता दिया है. I mean, it's the same thing that I've mentioned earlier as well. Indifference map arrangement of preferences show कर रहा है. It's basically the consumer is ranking the combinations in the order of preference, and he can state again ये जो बात लिखी है ना कि he can state if he prefers one combination to other or is indifferent between them. ये उसकी preference hypothesis है basically. ये consumer उसको rank कर सकता है. He knows के he prefers this over this or is indifferent between them, right? And he can rank it in the order of preference basically. Right? Now we are moving on to a very important topic that often students find confusing, and that is the marginal rate of substitution. Okay guys, so in order to understand the marginal rate of substitution, we first need to understand the shape of the indifference curve. So first of all guys, remember that if you draw the indifference curve incorrectly in the exam, although you label it as the indifference curve but you draw it incorrectly, you will definitely be penalized, and severely penalized, because if you draw an incorrect indifference curve and you show that the slope is not what it should be, then your marks will be deducted significantly. So the correct way to draw an indifference curve is that, remember that the indifference curve is convex to the origin. Now when you say it is convex to the origin, it simply means that the shape of the curve bends inwards toward the origin like this. So ये इंडिफरेंस कर्व ऐसे आ रहा है, ये बेंड इनवर्ड्स हो रहा है टूवर्ड्स दी ओरिजिन. सो ये पार्ट है, दिस इज इनवर्ड बेंडिंग टूवर्ड्स दी ओरिजिन. ठीक है. सो इंडिफरेंस कर्व आपने ऐसे नहीं बनाना, सही है? मतलब अक्सर ऐसे भी बना देते हैं बच्चे, लाइक एग्जाम ऐसे बनाया हुआ होगा. ठीक है, ये गलत है. इस तरीके से नहीं. ये आपका जो बेंड है ना, ये दिस शुड बी देयर इन द एग्जाम. ठीक है. अब ऊपर जो है वो आई वॉज सीइंग के यहाँ पे मैंने इस तरीके से बनाया हुआ था, तो यहाँ पे इतना बेंड आ नहीं रहा, ये बहुत रफली मैंने बनाया था. सो इसको आप छोड़ दें. ठीक है, तभी मैंने बाद में यहाँ लिख भी दिया है कि इसको यू डोंट नीड टू कॉपी दिस, ताकि आप इस तरीके से ना बना दें डिफरेंस कर्व, बिकॉज ये तो मैंने बस इन लाइन्स को ज्वाइन किया था, तो ये बहुत स्कैटर्ड थे पॉइंट्स, तो इसलिए वो शेप प्रॉपर आया नहीं. बट द वे यू नीड टू ड्रॉ, अगर आप यहाँ पे इंडिफरेंस कर्व देखें जो आई हैव ड्रॉन, इन सब में मैंने बेंड दिखाया हुआ है इनवर्ड, यानी कॉन्वेक्स बने हुए हैं टूवर्ड्स दी ओरिजिन. सो कॉन्वेक्स टू दी ओरिजिन, सही है, ये उसका शेप होगा. सो इट मीन्स, एंड जब हम बात करते हैं कि इट इज़ बोर्ड इनवर्ड्स टू दी ओरिजिन या कॉन्वेक्स टू दी ओरिजिन, इसका टेक्निकली या मैथमेटिकली मतलब होता है कि द स्लोप ऑफ द कर्व विल डिमिनिश as you move along it. So as we move along this curve, the slope will diminish as you move along it. Right? Okay, so you have a table that is given on the right that shows different combinations of x and y. And so if we plot all these combinations on the left and we join all these combinations, basically we get an indifference curve. And I'm labeling this as IC1. And so these the indifference curve is just showing different quantities of x and y that gives in the same equal satisfaction. So let's say that from A to B, if you look at from the table, from A to B, we are actually, so at A, we're basically having 12y and let's say 1x, and B, we have 8y and 2x, right? And if you look at from the table, if we go from A to B, we have an incremental x that is one more unit of x, but we have 4 less y. And so from B to C, we forgo 3y. From B to C, we forgo 3y for each x, for one more unit of good x, right? And so then from C to D, we are foregoing 2y and then 1y for each incremental unit of x, right? And so as we move from A to B, we get one more x. Then so the thing is, guys, firstly you need to understand that if we move from A to B, so we have one more x, right? But we have 4 less y. So the idea is that at B we'll feel as much satisfied and get as much, and we'll get the same level of utility. Although we're not quantifying utility, but we'll get the same level of ordinal utility at B as we were at A. So we'll feeling us left as satisfied as B as we were at A. So the thing is that if we move from A to B and we consume we have one more unit of x, right? So our utility or satisfaction should increase because now we have one more unit of x, which means that the satisfaction that we were getting at A, we should now have more satisfaction at B because now we have one more x. But the indifference curve shows us that each combination gives us equal satisfaction. So we need to take away or forgo or let go 4 units of y then, right? So that it makes us feeling as satisfied at B as we were at A, and making us indifferent at B or A, right? So that is why we forgo some good y. So we at point B, if we move from A to B, we forgo 4y. Similarly, when you move from B to C, we forgo 3y. From C to D, 2y and 1y for each unit of x. Because it has to be that way. We have to forgo some y as we move down the curve. Some good y. It could be any good on the vertical axis, right? So, and that is what shows why the curve is, the curve is sloping downwards. The indifference curve is sloping downwards, and it is also, convex to the origin. And I'll tell you what that means. But what we are saying is that we see that we are consuming more x, right? We see that we are consuming more of x as we are going down the curve, and we are consuming less of y, right? But the thing is, so in technical terms, what we are saying is that we are substituting good x for good y. As you go down the curve, we are actually substituting what? We are substituting good x, which means we are consuming more good x and less y. So we are substituting good x for good y, right? And hence now the thing is that once we have realized and understood that, okay, fine, as we move along the indifference curve and we move down the indifference curve, we are substituting good x for good y. So then economists need to measure the rate of this substitution. We need to measure the rate at which this substitution is occurring. And when economists measure the rate at which the substitution occurs, it's called the marginal rate of substitution. So guys, agar हम marginal rate of substitution, we talk about the marginal rate of substitution. So हम marginal rate of substitution निकालना है of x for y because we are substituting good x for y. So it would represent the amount of y which the consumer has to give up for the gain in one additional unit of x. एक extra x for one unit of x, how much y is the consumer willing to give up? Because the consumer, ये देखें इस चीज़ को समझें, ये consumer is willing to give up certain units of x for one more unit of y, ताकि उसकी satisfaction का level remains the same, right? So that is MRS. So अगर हम so for example, so what this means is that if we sort of see if the consumer moves from A to B, right? So how much is he giving up for each additional x from A to B? So for one more unit of x, right, he gives up how much? He gives up 4. So technically what we're doing is the marginal rate of substitution then actually becomes the slope of the indifference curve. And the slope of a curve is basically I mean, it's change in y over change in x. So change in y would represent the 4 units of y foregone divided by change in x, which is one more unit of x that we have, that the consumer consumes, and the bundle that he consumes at B has one more x but 4 less y. So obviously the satisfaction is the same at B as it is at A, and that makes it indifferent, and so the MRS is 4. So it represents that we are giving up 4 units of y for 1 unit of x such that our satisfaction remains the same. ठीक है, मैंने ये चीज़ यहाँ पे भी लिखी हुई है. MRS जो है वो change in y over change in x, exactly यही चीज़ लिखी हुई है. From A to B the consumer gives up 4 units of y for an additional unit of good x. ठीक है. Similarly अगर हम B से C पे जाते हैं, ठीक है, if we go from B to C, right, अब ये change in y छोटा हो गया है. This is, ये change in y की लेंथ देखें, ये change in y की लेंथ देखें, right. So again slope जो है वो और कम हो गई है. From B to C the slope would be, change in y would be B to C में क्या है, B to C is -3, right. So change in y would be the 3 foregone, and change in x would be 1 more x. So again the slope is -3. From C to D again देखें इसकी y की लेंथ फिर छोटी होगी. Slope is reducing. So slope जो होगी वो यहाँ C to D -2 हो जाएगी, right. And then D to E the slope is, again देखें, look at the size of this. I mean the slope is going down. The slope would be, from D to E it would be -1. So what we see over here is that, as we go down the indifference curve, the slope is getting flatter because you are foregoing less good y each time for one additional x. So as we go down the indifference curve, we are foregoing less y for each additional unit of good x. In other words, we can say that the rate at which we are substituting good x for good y, right, the rate at which we are substituting good x for good y is diminishing and reducing. Hence the word diminishing marginal return, hence the word diminishing marginal rate of substitution, comes into play. And that is why we say that the indifference curves are convex to the origin, because उसका जो shape convex है, ये इस बात को indicate कर रहा है कि the rate of substitution of good x for good y is decreasing. Diminishing marginal rate of substitution को indicate कर रहा है, right. ये चीज़ मैंने यहाँ लिखी हुई भी है. The shape of the indifference curve is governed by or due to the principle of the diminishing marginal rate of substitution, which means that the rate of substitution of good x for good y diminishes, decrease हो रहा है. जैसे हमने यहाँ किया 4 से 3, 3 to 2 and 1, meaning that the quantity of good y that the consumer is willing to sacrifice declines when he tries to get one more unit of x. देखें, ये इसको समझें. जब हम ये लिख रहे हैं ना, कि जब आप एग्जाम में लिखिएगा कि for each additional unit of x how much good y the consumer is foregoing, मतलब basically how much is he willing to forego, because हमें उसको indifferent करना है ना. Point B पे he has to be indifferent between points A and point B. So if he is consuming more of x, then how much is he willing to forego such that he is indifferent? Then if he is moved from B to C for one more x, how much is he now willing to forego? As he moves C to D, how much is he now willing to forego good y for one more x, right? Such that, because satisfaction हमें equal करनी है, indifferent करना है सारे combinations पे, right? So हमें क्या नज़र आ रहा है, as we go down the indifference curve, the slope of the indifference curve gets flatter and flatter. ये slope उसकी देखें flatter होती जा रही है. ये जो convex का shape है ना, ये जो convex shape आ रहा है board inwards, ये उसकी slope को flatter कर रहा है. Slope flat हो रही है. And the absolute value of the slope, ये जो absolute value है slope की, that is the marginal rate of substitution. Absolute value क्या है? ये 4 absolute value, -4, माइनस को छोड़ दें आप, 4 absolute value है, 3 absolute value है, 2 absolute value, ये absolute value है, 4, 3, 2, 1. ये जो है वो absolute value of the slope, that is the MRS, falls. So the slope of the indifference curve, which is actually the MRS, marginal rate of substitution, gets flatter as we go down the indifference curve, right? So what did we learn about the definition of MRS? If I ask you what will you write, you will write that MRS क्या है? MRS is basically, it is measuring the rate at which a consumer is willing to trade off one good, let's say good y. He's willing to trade off one good, that is good y, for another unit of, for an incremental unit of good x. ये line बहुत लिखना important है, while maintaining the same level of satisfaction. This is important. Now, guys, an important thing that we need to study is that, okay, fine, we know that the marginal rate of substitution goes down. We know what the marginal rate of substitution is and that it goes down as we go down the indifference curve, but then we need to know the reason why this happens or reason why the MRS diminishes. That is the reason why the consumer is willing to give up less and less of Y for each incremental good X as he slides down the curve. So why is that? So देखिए शुरू में अगर आप if you see that in this region obviously we have more good X. In this region we have less good X, but we have like more good Y, right? High quantities of Y. And as you go down the curve, like somewhere over here, you have, somewhere in these quantities, around these quantities, you have more good X while less good Y. And so the difference in the quantities of X and Y is the reason why, the MRS basically falls. Because the difference in these quantities results into differences in how people value good X and good Y, basically. And it follows that, at the top of the indifference curve, when the quantity of good Y is very high. So at the top of the indifference curve, where the consumer has more of good Y and less of good X, they are basically willing to give up a relatively large amount of good Y just to gain an additional unit of good X, because obviously X is scarce and is hence therefore more valuable to them. But as they move down the indifference curve, the consumer is now willing to trade less amounts of Y for more X, because now since the quantity of Y is going down while the quantity of X is going up, so now they value Y more than good X, and therefore each time they want to give up less of Y for an incremental X, because Y is getting scarce now and hence more valuable to the consumer then. यही चीज़ मैंने यहाँ पे भी एक्सप्लेन की हुई है, लिखी हुई है इनफैक्ट मैंने. This is the intensity of his want. Let me correct this. So what I've written is that when the consumer has more and more of good X, the intensity of his want for that good or desire for that good goes on declining, because now he has more of X, right? And it is because of this fall in the intensity of the want for good X that when its stock increases, यानी जैसे जैसे good X की stock increase होता जाता है from 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7 and 8, he is prepared to forgo less and less of good Y, because now he has more of X, so he values less X. So he values less X, good X, and he's like, okay, fine, I value less good X, so maybe I want to forgo less of Y. And when the stock of good X goes up, he is prepared to forgo less and less of good Y for every increment in X. And so in the beginning, what you can see is that when the consumer stock of good Y is relatively large, when he has more quantities of good Y, let's say 12, 10, right? In this part and in this region, and his stock of good X is small, like in this region, his marginal significance for good Y is low, because obviously that good, he has more abundance of good Y. So his marginal significance for good Y is low, right? While his marginal significance for good Y is high. Marginal significance का मतलब है कि obviously he क्योंकि X की quantity इतनी कम है शुरू में उसके पास कि एक यूनिट भी उसको X का और मिल जाएगा, he is willing to trade so many units of Y. बट अब जब X के ज़्यादा यूनिट्स आ जाते हैं और Y के कम बच जाएंगे, तो he is obviously willing to forgo less units of Y for an incremental X now. And it is because of this higher marginal significance of good X and a lower marginal significance of good Y in the beginning, since the marginal significance of good Y is less while the marginal significance of good X is very high because X is scarce initially, the consumer is willing to give up larger of Y for each unit of X. वही बात लिखी है, but as the stock of good X increases and the intensity of desire for it falls, obviously he would want less of it now. I mean, the desire for wanting an additional X would go down. So his marginal significance of good X will diminish. देखिए ये सब analysis है basically आपकी. So marginal significance of good X will diminish, while on the other hand, क्योंकि जब when he'll have, so towards in this region he'll have more of X and less of Y now, right? So the stock of good y will be decreasing as he gets more and more of x, and then so the intensity of his desire for it, y is going down, the stock is going y is going down, so the intensity of a desire for it increases. That is, we can say the marginal significance for good y goes up. मार्जिनल सिग्निफिकेंस का मतलब है कि अब उसके लिए कंज्यूमर के लिए each additional unit of y is worth a lot. And as a result, therefore, as the individual is substituting more and more of good x for good y, he is prepared to give up each time he gets one more unit of x, he is prepared to forgo or give up less and less of y for each additional unit of x, right? And so that is why the marginal rate of substitutions falls as you go down the indifference curve. Now, a very interesting thing that I've written over here is that okay, fine, so we got the reason why the MRS is declining, but can we say that the diminishing marginal utility, DMU, this stands for diminishing marginal utility, can we say that could DMU be the reason for falling MRS? Or can we sort of connect this with DMU? तो ये कोई different explanation नहीं है जो यहाँ लिखी है. It's sort of the same that we have written over here, but we can also connect this with diminishing marginal utility as well. And the reason is so if we connect it with DMU to the concept of diminishing marginal rate of substitution, or the diminishing marginal utility being the reason for a declining MRS or a diminishing MRS, what it follows is that, let's say that when a consumer has a small quantity of one good, so let's say that this is your indifference curve, and you have oranges here and apples here. So let's say when a consumer when a consumer is starting with a relatively small quantity of one good, let's say small quantity of oranges and high quantity of apples. So the MRS for substituting oranges for apples is initially high, which means that the consumer would be willing to forgo more apples for each incremental orange. And they're willing to give up a significant amount of good, that is apples here, and the reason is that they have abundant apples. They have a huge quantity of apples right now, in exchange for a small amount of the other good, that is orange. So for each additional orange, because you see they have already less oranges, so for each additional orange they are willing to give up large apples. And the reason is that because getting the first unit of that other good provides a substantial increase in their overall satisfaction, right? So for initially, each additional unit of orange would give them a huge amount of satisfaction. So we could say that, however, as they consume more of the other good, that is oranges, the total quantity of it increases as the consumer, because so मतलब इसका कहने का ये है कि for initially शुरू में for every incremental orange the marginal utility initially, what's going to happen is that the additional satisfaction, the marginal utility that you would get from X is very high, right? And so in that sense, you are willing to forgo more of Y for each incremental X. But as you consume more of the other good, that is oranges, the total quantity of it increases, which means that the marginal utility of X declines as you consume more of X. Since the marginal utility of oranges, that is oranges basically good X यहाँ पे, and since the marginal utility of good X, that is oranges, is diminishing, because each additional orange now provides less additional satisfaction, because now you have a lot of oranges. So they become less willing to trade as many apples. So consumer is less willing to trade or give up as many apples as before, because because the good right now they have is in abundance. That is, they have abundant amount of oranges right now, somewhere over here. So now you want to, for each additional orange now, that since the marginal utility for an incremental orange is low, that is why you don't really want to give up huge amount of good Y for it, that is apples for it. So अब ये कह सकते हैं कि as a consumer consumes more of good X, the additional X being oranges here, the additional satisfaction or utility that they derive from each unit of good X decreases. As you consume more of oranges, the additional utility, or the marginal utility you get from each unit of X decreases, right? And this is the law of diminishing marginal utility. As you consume more of X, the marginal utility from X declines. So initially when you have fewer units of X, that is fewer units of oranges, each extra unit of good X or each extra unit of orange is valuable to you, is valuable to the consumer. But as the consumer consumes more and more of X, then the marginal utility basically from, consuming more additional unit falls. And similarly, simultaneously, what happens is that as the consumer consumes fewer units of goods Y, because obviously slowly and slowly the quantity of Y is going down. So as the consumer consumes fewer units of good Y, the satisfaction they get from each remaining unit of Y rises. Right? So whatever Y you have remaining, which is already, scarce now in this region, somewhere in this region, you have less and less of Y. So that's why you see the slope is getting flatter and flatter. As you're going down the curve, the slope is getting flatter, meaning you want to trade less Y for X. So when a good becomes, that is when a good यानी apples or good Y becomes scarcer, लिखे scarcer हो जाता है in their consumption. Good Y is now becoming scarcer in their consumption, somewhere close to here, right? So when a good becomes scarcer in their consumption bundle में good X की quantity ज़्यादा है और good Y is कम है, so the marginal utility from Y will increase. The marginal utility from Y will increase, which actually, what do you mean by marginal utility of Y will increase? It simply means that the consumer begins to value each unit of Y more because now they have less of it. So when you're saying that the marginal utility of Y goes up because now the consumer has less of Y and more of X, what you're saying is, इसको लिख लें, that the consumer begins to value, लिख लें इसको, that the consumer begins to value each unit of good Y more because now they have less of it. So at the top of the indifference curve, in this region, somewhere in this region maybe, the consumer has more good Y and less good X. So they are willing to give up a large amount of good Y to gain an additional unit of X because X is scarce now initially and therefore it is valuable. So क्योंकि X valuable है, so each additional unit से जो उसको X में utility मिलेगी, marginal utility of X would be high because now X is valuable. So he would be willing to forgo large amounts of Y. But as you move down the indifference curve, they accumulate more and more of X. So as you go down, you accumulate more and more of X. And you sort of give up more and more of Y by accumulating. So accumulating more and more of X, you are giving up more and more of Y. But the thing is that as the once your diminishing marginal utility of X arises, that is, when the marginal utility of X decreases, because obviously बात है ना, you have more of X now, you have more oranges now. So as the marginal utility of X decreases, and why would it decrease? Because now you have more of it, and since you have more of it, then the additional utility from X will go down. And since you have less of Y, since you have less of Y in your consumption bundle, then the marginal utility of Y would increase, since you have less of it. So in that case, the consumer becomes less willing to trade. The consumer becomes less willing to trade large amounts of Y for more incremental X because now they value Y more and X less, right? And that is why, because they are valuing Y more and less X, so they are willing to trade less of Y for an incremental X, right? Because now the marginal utility of Y is very high while the marginal utility of X is very low. And because the marginal utility of X is low, they don't want to give up huge amounts of Y, right? Because X की जब marginal utility ही low है, incremental X हासिल करने से low utility मिलनी है because वो already इतना abundant हो गया है. So और Y की marginal utility जो है वो already very high हो गई है because वो scarce हो गया है. So why would they be willing to forgo large amounts of Y now? So ये concept आप इससे connect करेंगे तो और भी अच्छा हो जाएगा. और ये connection आपको पता होना चाहिए because ये जो next video मेरी आने वाली है ना, वो diminishing, ये एक बड़ा important formula की derivation मैं आप लोगों को सिखाऊंगा in my next video basically. Which will actually connect the concept जहाँ पे MRS basically video होगी, marginal rate of substitution in relation to marginal utility की, a very good derivation over there, or when a very good connection that I will derive to you guys. So देखें convexity की जो बात है indifference curve की convex shape होने की, वो यही है कि it is because of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. And as you move down the indifference curve, so marginal rate of substitution declines. And अगर उसको marginal utility से link करना है तो वो यही है कि as you go down the indifference curve, the marginal utility of x decreases. The marginal utility of x goes down as you go down the indifference curve because you consume more of it. You consume more of x. You consume more of good x. And the marginal utility of y increases because now you have less of x. So since you are consuming less of it now because you have less of it in your bundle, so the marginal utility goes up. Therefore, the consumer is progressively, less willing to give up good y to obtain more of x, which leads to a flatter slope on the indifference curve as you move downwards. And that is why the indifference curve is convex to the origin, right? So I hope you understood this concept and you understood the video. So I think I'll be ending the video here. I'll see you all around in the next video. Until then, take care.